Good morning, and thank you for joining us for an inspiring conversation about tariffs, trade, and Canada's place in the world. My name is Debora VanNijnatten, and I'm professor of political science and North American studies at Laurier and a scholar of Canada-US environmental relations. I'm also a faculty member and associate director at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. I'm honored to be your moderator today as we contemplate the implications of the Trump administration's unprecedented actions on the trade front. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Laurier's Kitchener, Waterloo, Brantford, and Milton campuses are close to 18 First Nation communities and 12 Métis councils. The Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations are only a 15-minute drive from our Brantford campus. The Waterloo campus is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples. Perhaps you are joining us from another location, and in that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked where you reside. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and water. Now, this morning, I'm going to begin by sharing a quick lay of the land, given how rapidly things are changing and developing in Canada-US relations. And I want to put our panel discussion today in a bit of a historical perspective. Then I will invite my colleagues, Patricia Goff, Michael Haughton, and Stephen Snudden to a panel conversation followed by audience Q&A. So feel free, though, the whole time to pop your questions in the Q&A box as we go. Don't wait, right? So get them flowing so that in the background here, we can start queuing up our discussion. So for those listening today who are struggling to make sense of what is happening on the Canada-US trade front, not to mention the broader relationship, you are in good company. In a matter of months, much of what we have assumed we knew about the pillars that underlie the Canada-US relationship and how it functions have been called into question. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious right now than in Canada-US trade relations. Canada has been conducting a long-running internal debate about how close we actually want to be with the United States. And I would say specifically on the degree to which we want our economy to be intertwined with that of the US versus supporting and protecting our national economy, often behind tariff walls. In fact, this has historically been one of the most divisive issues on the political agenda in Canada. The 1988 election marked a key historical point at which, against considerable opposition by various interests in Canada, we chose to move closer to the US economically. At the time, Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney argued that Canada could not afford to be locked out of an increasingly protectionist US, and that it would be the best chance for Canada to succeed in increasingly globalized and competitive markets. A few years later, we got concerned that we were going to get left out in the cold as the Americans started negotiating with their neighbors to the south on a free trade deal. And Canada entered into trilateral negotiations on the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA as we know it. But alongside that debate during another election campaign, actually, and on both the Canadian side and the American side, we actually talked about a broader form of North American integration that would join the three countries together economically, in some senses culturally, and also tighten policy cooperation. And we might think of NAFTA as becoming a high water mark for moving closer to the US. And I would add that not long after that, Laurier's North American Studies program was put in place. Then came Donald Trump, who campaigned in 2016 on how terrible and unfair NAFTA was. And after his election, the US administration pretty much dragged Canada and Mexico into negotiations on a new agreement. And the debate in Canada really centered on whether we were giving away too much in the resulting agreement, the USMCA. Again, that tension between being pulled by the economic weight of the US market and that huge consumer base, yet being concerned about our future as an economically independent sovereign nation. Aspirations of deeper integration are sort of long gone, I would say. And Canadians at that time, and I would say now, are focused on mitigating economic uncertainty. So this brings us to recent weeks where Canada has experienced the whipsaw of, first threats that the US would apply tariffs to Canada across sectors, then the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum, then a reprieve on other sectors until April 2nd, which was yesterday, to the news yesterday that we are not subject to the reciprocal tariffs that are being applied to countries across the world, but a 25% tariff has been imposed on cars being imported into the US, including Canadian cars. So that public debate about what our economic future should look like, about what the balance should be between wanting to shore up our economic ties with the US and reduce that economic uncertainty, or to diversify our trade relations and economic activities to other markets, other countries, other places in the world, is really now in full swing. So at this point, I would like to introduce my colleagues and fellow panelists for today's discussion, because they're going to help us understand where we are in this current moment, particularly given the events of yesterday. Dr. Patricia Goff is a professor of political science at Laurier. She specializes in international political economy, international relations theory, and international organization, with a particular interest in trade and the cultural capacity of international organizations. Dr. Michael Haughton is a professor in the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics and the CN Fellow in Supply Chain Management. His research focuses on freight transportation and logistics. And Dr. Stephen Snudden is assistant professor in the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics. His primary research interests are in the fields of macroeconomics, as well as international economics and finances. So thank you to all three of you for sharing your time with us this morning. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And Patty, maybe I'll start with you and direct the first question your way. As we think about the actions that were unveiled by the Trump administration yesterday on the Rose Garden lawn with our little, poster, what are a few of the things that our audience should understand as they watch the news unfold in the coming days, weeks, and even months? So maybe just give us a few sort of touch points there.
Sure, thank you. Yes, it's very quick after what was truly an unprecedented press conference in the Rose Garden yesterday. We thought we might know what to expect, but even though some of those expectations were fulfilled, it's still quite a sobering event in sort of trade history. And right off the top, we know that what came out of that meeting was sort of a minimum baseline tariff of 10% for all countries, for all imports coming into the United States, and much higher reciprocal tariffs for about 60 countries. So I guess I would say two things as sort of my initial takeaways in maybe the first 18 hours. The first thing I would say is that there is a temptation for us in Canada to think that we got a reprieve yesterday, that we somehow did well out of that. And I personally would caution against drawing that conclusion just yet for a couple of reasons. One, several ongoing trade irritants in the US-Canada relationship were called out in the Rose Garden yesterday. They will come back. They have not gone away. So we should be ready for that. The other reason I would not necessarily view yesterday as a reprieve or somehow doing well is because there's a full suite of tariffs now that are being applied to us. We aren't getting the reciprocal tariffs, but as you mentioned, Deborah, 25% tariffs went into effect last night on automobiles. We'll get some clarity on that in the coming days, how those will be applied such that the tariffs are actually only on the US content of those automobiles. Parts tariffs are expected within a month. Of course, there are 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. There are still 25% tariffs on any goods going into the United States that are not covered by or not compliant with CUSMA. And the exception there is 10% tariffs on non-CUSMA compliant energy and potash. So From the US side, there are still significant tariffs that are being applied to Canadian goods going into that market. And it's worth noting that there are other tariffs in play. I guess it was 2 weeks ago, China imposed significant tariffs on Canada, in particular, 100% tariffs on Canadian canola exports, 25% on pork and seafood. And of course, our own set of retaliatory tariffs to the tune of about $60 billion of US goods are in place. So it's interesting to note last night, some of you may have seen the RBC put out a quick analysis that basically said in the aggregate, the average US tariff rate on imports from Canada as a result of yesterday will probably rise from 2.5% to 3.5%. And that aggregate number could give us some solace. But I would say that the impact on specific sectors is enormous, not to mention the underlying uncertainty about what is to come. So I think this is a very serious time. And I'm not taking much solace from the argument that we might have gotten a reprieve yesterday. The other thing that I would say, just as a sort of opening set of comments on yesterday, there's also a temptation after yesterday to think that the rules of the trading system still matter. Some of the commentary that we saw yesterday is that we did not receive reciprocal tariffs because CUSMA was respected, the NAFTA 2.0, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, that somehow CUSMA held. And so we and Mexico and Canada, neither of us, the other CUSMA signatories, were on the receiving end of reciprocal tariffs. And that's another conclusion that I'm not yet ready to draw. Many countries on that reciprocal tariff list have bilateral agreements with the United States, South Korea, Israel, many others. So the bilateral trade agreement did not hold in their instances. I'm not sure we should interpret it as having held in ours. And of course, just about all of the countries on the list are members of the WTO, and in theory, subject to the commitments that we have made in that forum. And all of these commitments, in some respect, were overruled by the President Trump finding the authority to impose tariffs from the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, which allows him to identify a national emergency and act in response to it. So on the one hand, it might be premature to declare the death of the global trading system, but I think it's also probably not wise to assume that it is offering us any certainty as we move forward. And I think that point is important because we are anticipating negotiations with the United States in the near term. We are required to negotiate with the United States as part of the built-in review of CUSMA, which has to happen before 2026. And of course, we know that the phone call between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump ended with a commitment to having some sort of conversation after April 28th if Prime Minister Carney remains in that office. So I think it's interesting to think about whether a renegotiated trade agreement actually will provide the sort of certainty and predictability that it has in the past and that we hope it would in the future.
Great, thanks, Patty. Just two little clarifications there. One, could you tell us what were the trade irritants or the sectors that were called out yesterday by President Trump in
Dairy,
yeah.
lumber,
Yeah.
A couple of others.
Yeah.
But for sure, dairy is always top of mind.
Dairy is the big
and
one.
lumber. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
Well, we can talk about dairy because that's not an accurate it's not accurate, the 250% tariff that we impose. That's actually not been imposed. That only gets imposed after the US has exported into Canada a quantity above a certain quota rate, and that's never happened. So that's actually, that tariff has never been imposed.
Great, thank you. And just for those joining us today, so I refer to the existing North American Trade Agreement as the USMCA, and Patty referred to it as Kuzma, right? And so one of the interesting things about the most recent trade agreement is that we all have our own name for it, right? And we put our country first. Mexico does the same thing, but we're all talking about the same trade agreement. Michael, I wonder if I could turn to you. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the types of impacts that tariffs are going to have on Canadian businesses and consumers? And can we think a little bit about the short, medium, and long term? Like, what are we likely to see sooner? And then, what are we likely to see a little bit later?
You used in your opening, Deb, the term whiplash, and I think that is so apropos. And I'm glad, Patricia mentioned that we should not necessarily view yesterday as a win or a reprieve. This is something that is really it's ongoing. In terms of your question, you asked what are some of the things that might happen. There are some of these things that have happened. Let's first clarify, what exactly is a supply chain? Because it's something that a lot of us talk about, but I think it's good to sort of set some baseline as to what exactly it is. Essentially, if we think of where something is produced or farmed and where something is finally consumed, all the processes that take place between those 2 points, that's really what the supply chain is about. And in this discipline, we like to talk about the 5 supply chain rights. We said, well, goods have to be at the right place, the right time, the right condition, at the right price. So we need all of those, conditions to be met. When it comes to the price, this is one of the challenges of tariffs. First off, if we think about automobile, for example, where profit margins are in the single digits, and we're looking at tariffs that are at least 10%, it could be as high as 25%, depending on how you go about figuring out what is CUSMA compliant and what isn't. And so right away, that wipes away the profit margins of these companies. So from the standpoint of price, there is no way for those companies to give consumers a reprieve by absorbing some of those costs. So the right in terms of price, we have a problem there. Now, there's also a behavioral element to this as well. One of the things I've heard in the past few days is that there are people who are now choosing to buy their cars right now in anticipation of a higher price later on. That is also something problematic for supply chains because supply chains generally rely on a certain level of stability. Yes, there'll be bumps along the road, but we don't expect these significant spikes. Once you have these significant spikes and then you have to come back down after the spikes, because if they buy the cars now, well, they're not going to buy those cars later on. That is something that adds to the cost. In supply chains, it's not just the goods that flow, it's also the flow of money and the flow of information. And the flow of information, that is also something that could be significantly disrupted. Think about trying to, for example, do the math to figure out what is the appropriate tariff that you have to pay based on the fact that there are 30,000 parts in an automobile, and then have to convince a border official that you have done the math right. That leads to frictions in the supply chain. So the other right that gets messed up here now is the right associated with time. We don't get stuff done on time. Now, these kinds of frictions, we have seen this movie before. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, they published something that they call the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. And that index, typically it varies between +1 and -1. +1 meaning that there is pressure, there's friction, the supply chain is not flowing smoothly. And -1, it's flowing more smoothly than it normally would. Now, this went up to as high as 4 during the height of the pandemic, but generally it has stayed where it is. Now, if we look at the numbers in 2016 for a 3-year period, when Trump 1.0 started to talk about tariffs, that pressure index continued to rise. Now, some people may accuse me of mixing up correlation with causation, but I think there is something there. And what we're now seeing is that index, it's actually coming back up again. And the Federal Reserve Bank has had to revise its estimate upwards in anticipation of further disruptions or difficulties with the supply chain. So those I see as some of the shorter term impacts. We don't get stuff on time and things will cost more. In terms of the long to medium term, I think risk is the word that I would use to describe how supply chains will unfold and how they will be managed. Now, supply chain professionals, we're used to this notion of risk. We think about risk in terms of, for example, natural disasters. These things can disrupt supply chains. We think about risk in terms of accidents, the Latmegantic accident, the rail accident, a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. We think about in terms of nefarious actions, piracy on the high seas. And we also think about it in terms of coercive, hostile actions from other countries. Now, normally, when we think about those hostile and coercive actions, we think about them in terms of countries that we have clearly labeled as hostile. And so we sort of have this dichotomy. Some people are friends and some people are hostile. I think one of the things that this has shown us is that labeling, it is very fluid. So meaning that someone that we label as friend will not always act in a friendly manner towards us. So I think going forward in trying to manage our supply chain risks, there will be a more pragmatic, almost a dispassionate view rather than a sentimental view of friend versus foe, but more a matter of saying, it's not that, well, a friend has disappointed us and so we're done with you. It's more a matter of, well, we will do business with you, but under what conditions will we do business with you? And I think that is what will help to shape supply chains as we go forward. Now, it's something I can talk about for a little bit further, but I just hold off for now and just say that I think risk management, a broader conception of risk management is one of the things I think that will define the way we manage supply chains going forward.
Thanks, Michael. And that also, you can see how that cascades into the broader Canada-US relationship, right? As you
Absolutely.
said, that dispassionate, how is it that we move forward in a business sense, for sure. So I'd like to ask another question, Stephen, about what is going on in a policy sense. So how can Canada really respond to support households, protect employment, encourage investment at what is becoming an incredibly uncertain time? So I'll hand that one over to you.
Well, thank you. And this is a really important question. I mean, we are all facing a federal election and about to vote on what policy response we want. First of all, I would just say there is a ton that we can do, right? And we are very lucky to be Canadian in the sense that we have very strong social supports so that people facing economic hardships and who are unfortunate to lose their jobs do have a strong unemployment insurance program. And the government has already made it easier for them to get those payments sooner, for longer and larger payments across Canada. So this is, an automatic thing that will happen, and it's going to be incredibly important for families that are going to be hurt by this trade war. The second thing is we are all going to face higher prices when we shop. The Bank of Canada has warned that inflation will increase. And we have to realize that this trade war will take some time to resolve. Last time it took a year to resolve. And we don't have unlimited capacity to respond, so we have to be careful about it. We have to have a measured response. And I think in this case, recent lessons learned suggest that we really shouldn't just be handing out paychecks to people in untargeted ways that maybe don't need it. I think that, especially right now, we need to put that money to good use to create jobs and to, people who are going to lose employment, they don't want to fish, right? They want the ability to keep fishing. They want to do this themselves and have those opportunities. So this sort of leads us to the second thing, like how do we get the policies in place to create the employment, to get people back working, to encourage investment in Canada. And really, employment and investment are the same thing. They're linked. We need to keep creating jobs in Canada, keep creating businesses. And the great thing is like we've got a ton of opportunities to do that. First of all, we really need to just invest and make Canada great again. I mean, even in the Waterloo region, we are particularly vulnerable because of our manufacturing and autos and our high tech. But you know, we have a lot of government-ready projects like where's Highway 7? Let's start building it. Let's get this hospital in the Waterloo region, right? We have amazing universities for getting workers back and you know, and a great incubator for new businesses and activities. So let's invest in our universities. The second thing is, you know, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. Right? This is a bit of a game changer. We need to fill in our value-added gaps. We produce a lot of resources, and we were happy to send those resources to the States to get processed. And we didn't want to, you know, because it was easy to do. But now we need to bring those businesses back to Canada. It's going to be costly for them to cross the border. That means we need to build factories in Canada to, you know, to fill in those gaps. The things we used to send to the States, guess what? We need to do it here now. And that's going to create employment opportunities. The important thing from a policy perspective, though, is really to make sure that our retaliation to the US tariffs doesn't drive up our costs of our manufacturers, right? So if we have a producer in Canada or in the Waterloo region and we're building high-tech machines, let's try to keep their costs as low as possible. Because if we want to diversify our trade, if we want to trade with other regions, we need to have competitive products. We need to keep our prices low, and we have to make sure that our retaliation doesn't hurt our manufacturers further. And this is going to create actually some opportunity if we do this right. You know, we are the Waterloo region, like we are the hacksmiths, right? We have high tech manufacturing. We're like a tech hub. You know, we got a versatile, brilliant workforce. So we can fill in these gaps. We can provide these value added. We can bring down production costs. We can, you know, fill in these gaps in Canada. And, you know, start processing our resources and turning our resources into final products. Like we can do that. And this is just going to create a lot of this disruption is global, right? It's going to create a lot of opportunity. And, you know, like I was visiting Mexico last year, they love this whole idea of reshoring, and like they were having a whole boom there because when things were brought back to the States, it created a ton of opportunities in Mexico too. And just the final thing I'll say is like, you know, we need to reduce uncertainty. So fortunately, like industry right now is saying, look, this is probably going to be temporary. We don't know how to respond. And the problem is, so that's sort of the good news, right? They kind of still expect it to be temporary. The bad news is that this uncertainty is because of pausing investments in job creation, right? But there's a ton of things that we can do policy-wise to actually reduce uncertainty for businesses. Like we can change our laws to reduce uncertainty so much that it could even offset the increased uncertainty coming from these tariffs and create like business opportunities. So, you know, things that we could do, like could reduce red tape, yes, interprovincial barriers, but also like guaranteeing approval of projects within a certain time frame, and you know, reducing anything that increases costs for new investments is going to be super important going forward.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephen. So I would like to go to our Q&A portion of our discussion. And just a reminder, if you've got questions, pop them in that Q&A box, okay? And we've got folks behind the scenes that are working hard to bring them forward. But let's go to our first question. And that is, what do you think are the calculations going on in Canadian governments about retaliating via our energy exports? So that's a political question about the degree to which we actually use our energy exports as a tool or a weapon. And I'm not sure which of you would like to maybe start with that one. You can just give me a little hands up if you want. Okay, Stephen, go for it.
Just a couple of things there. First, I think one of the lessons we can learn from, say, the Mexico versus Canada response to Trump is that we should try not to agitate further. We stand up for ourselves. We are proud as Canadians. But I think making threats is probably not the right way to go. We need a strategic response on all levels of government to do so. So, and I'll leave it to the future government to play the cards right. The second thing is the idea that like our energy is very important to the US, and our critical minerals and our nickel production, like these things are incredibly important. Our aluminum and steel, these are all very important for US production, okay? This isn't going to change anytime soon. There's fundamental reasons for this. We have the resources, right? And, we can send them to the US, but, the nice thing about these sort of natural resources is we can send them elsewhere, right? As Canadians, we know that actually our oil prices are some of the lowest in the world. They were kept low because we didn't have the pipelines to move them around. And now we do, because the government took initiatives to build pipelines and get the oil not just to the US, but to global markets. That's helping Canada, right? And if the US doesn't like our cheap energy, well, we can always raise the price of it for them by putting an export tax on it too. We don't necessarily need to cut them off. But as I think the more important thing from a Canadian strategic point of view is we need to create those opportunities and the ability to diversify our energy portfolio.
Okay, thank you. Patty.
Just say a quick thing about that. I think using energy for retaliation is in some respects the nuclear option for Canada. I don't think we're there. Certainly it's not warranted by yesterday. But I think in addition to some of the things Stephen points out, that there are calculations about how it will be received in the United States. There are calculations about how it will be received in Canada. And we're a very regionalized economy. Using that sector for retaliatory purposes has a disproportionate effect on certain regions and not others. And at a moment when national unity is really important, I don't think we're willing to take that chance.
Great, thank you. Michael, did you want to weigh in here at all?
Sort of an indirect response to the question, but it's something that builds on what Stephen just said about a measured response, thinking strategically. And here I want to bring up the example of New Zealand. And I'm sure Canada is also thinking along those lines. I've not seen specific examples of it, but one of the things that New Zealand has done is this. They have put together two lists that they maintain very fastidiously. So one list, they identify all the things that they need from others. It's critical to their economy. And the second list, it goes the other way, things that others need from them. And so what they do essentially is to use those lists to calibrate their diplomacy. So who do we need to talk to? How do we need to talk to them? And so on. And it prevents them, I think, from making rash decisions. And which is why I really like what Stephen has said. We're sort of in the heat of battle right now. And so in the heat of battle, there's always a risk of going overboard. One of the things that we heard yesterday, for example, was that Mark Carney should be careful not to gloat about this as a win, because that can inflame passions, and then it becomes another set of problems that we have. So I think a larger answer to the question is really about being very strategic in responding while you're in the midst of the battle.
So Michael, can I just follow that up and just ask you, is it your sense that Canada is not strategic like that, or is not being as strategic as they might be?
I think there are moves afoot in that direction. So one of the things that Canada has been working on for the last several years is what they call a national supply chain strategy. Now, that strategy is yet to be unveiled. They have, however, set up an office, and this office is called the National Supply Chain Office, and that is under the auspices of Transport Canada. Mm-hmm. And You might guess from that, infrastructure is an important part of that national supply chain strategy. The preliminary reports coming out of the CD Howe Institute as to what is in that plan indicates that there is some strategic thinking. So just to give you, a few examples, they have acknowledged that, look, this notion of comparative advantage, meaning that there are just some things that it's better off for us to buy from others, and some things it's better off for us to produce ourselves. So that is an explicit line in the various items that they're looking at. So my sense is that they are being strategic. We're just not seeing enough of it in real published form. But yeah, I certainly believe that they're being quite strategic. But again, what we have to always be careful of is that sometimes we can forget the strategic imperatives when we're in the heat of the moment. And so it's
Right.
very careful about that.
Yes, and passions are certainly inflamed right now. I would agree with that. So maybe this discussion leads nicely into a question about diversification. And we've heard so many voices calling for diversification of Canada's trade and economic activity away from the US and towards other partners, Europe, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. Lots of discussion about that. And yet, certainly my reading of our, the past few decades is that attempts to do this at various points using the policy levers that were open to governments, has not been successful. So I'm just wondering, are the conditions any different now that would, I guess, allow us to make more effective moves towards diversifying our trade away from the US, right? So has anything in the current thing changed, or are we sort of destined to be stuck in this, orbit where the economic gravity to the south just keeps pulling us in? Yeah, Patty, go ahead.
I'm happy to answer that, but before I do, I'll just note, and I think it's been noted in the Q&A, this is the nature of this business. This is unfolding in real time. So as we are on this call today, Prime Minister Carney is announcing 25% tariffs on US autos. So stay tuned, but that's the nature of it, right? You need to check the news every 10 or 15 minutes because it's unfolding in real time. But on the question of diversification, I think is an important one, regardless of what's unfolding. I would say things have changed a little bit. You're right that diversification has been top of mind for Canadian governments for decades. And I would say we've been very good at step one of the diversification process, but it's actually a two-step process. So we've been very good at the governmental level in negotiating trade agreements that will open markets for our firms. We've got, we've got a number of trade agreements, and we often boast that we are the only G7 country to have trade agreements with every other G7 country. So we've done a very good job on that part of the diversification puzzle. But then, and my economist colleagues can probably speak more to this, then we need the firms to make the pivot. And it's that firm pivot that hasn't always happened in previous decades for reasons that you've shared, Deborah, that gravity pulls toward the United States. There's a logic for many firms in many sectors to stick with the United States. Certainly, sometimes they take advantage of the new markets that have been open in addition to the United States. But to get that pivot away from the United States to new markets is a very difficult thing to do. So what has changed, though, is, of course, the calculation here, because as the access to the U.S. market becomes much more expensive, and as some of the things that Michael was mentioning, the relationship itself is becoming a little bit more fraught, the calculations that firms might make to make that pivot will be different. So the incentives are different.
Right, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just a few, quick words on that. And this is the kind of thing that we could go on and on about. It really is very interesting. Diversification, I also think of it in terms of internal diversification as well. So it's not just to new markets, and those are important. I want to come back, to what I said, earlier, about this, friendly versus hostile, dichotomy. Um, because anyone can take hostile action at any point in time, we also want to take that into account as well. And so I still think it does come back to under what conditions do I do business with you? The center of gravity, you're right, it's still going to always pull towards the US. I don't recall where I saw this, but someone has described tariff fights as a knife fight between two people, but instead of holding the handle, they're holding the blade.
That's a good one.
What you're really trying to do is just for someone to say, well, uncle, let's just stop. Okay? And so my suspicion is that over time, again, predictions, we always take a risk when we make these predictions, is that over time, some of these irritants will go away between us and the US. Now, it does not mean that diversification should be ignored. But we always have to be pragmatic, regardless of who we're doing business with.
Right. And it's funny. I was at a forum on Tuesday where we were talking about diversification, and a former trade negotiator sort of broke into the discussion and said, be careful, because it's not that Canada wants to trade less with the US. It's just that we want to keep what we've got and trade more with the rest of the world, right? So that we even how we think about, it's not that we want to replace necessarily the US. We want to preserve that economic activity and that exchange across the border, but actually we do want more happening with other partners around the world as well. Stephen, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick thing. First of all, I completely agree that it's really about adding more opportunity rather than, saying no to the US going forward. I think that's we are proud it's in our national anthem, but I think we have to be careful that, things change in the future too, and we have a beneficial trade relationship. And the other thing is that history is sort of says this is harder to do for Canada than we even might realize. Like in the 1930s, like 90, this is like history repeating itself, right? US imposed these tariffs on us unexpectedly, double tariffs from 20 to 40%. Canada tried really hard to diversify with the other Commonwealth countries, and it had a hard time doing so because we're right across the river from each other. Our costs of shipping are super low. They're a huge market. That said, there's just so many things that we can do. I mean, I walked past the LCBO yesterday and the shelves are empty. That's appalling. It shouldn't be that way. I would love to have the amazing world-class Quebec cider fill those shelves, right? And the wines and the meads and the beers from Alberta. Like, I want those import diversification opportunities within Canada. That's easy to do. We just need to stop being selfish and let it happen. And the other thing is a lot of our exports that are harder to ship elsewhere. Like, let's say you have a giant ingot of metal, this huge heavy metal that you want to send somewhere else in the world other than the US, it does increase our shipping costs. Well, one thing we can do is actually make that good more valuable, right? We turn it into a lamppost before we ship it. The average cost of shipping relative to the price of the good goes down, and we make more money, and it's easier for us to ship. So that's just an idea for the diversification.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna pivot just a little bit here, because I would like to ask about, well, I think it's a question for Michael. So we certainly experienced a lot of supply chain disruptions during Trump's first term related to the pandemic, and you pointed that out. In our current moment, folks are talking about this interprovincial trade, and this kind of pulls up on what Stephen was just talking about, right? Is that in any way a tool for mitigating what is happening to us on the Canada-US front, or is that something that's really limited in its scope?
Yeah, I would say limited. And when we look at the numbers, two-thirds of Canada's GDP is in international trade. In terms of domestic trade, it's probably anywhere between 18 and 20%. Let's imagine that as Carney as promised, if he becomes prime minister, is that come Canada Day, all of those interprovincial irritants are removed. The IMF has estimated, well, even before Carney made this statement, back in 2019, the IMF estimated that this will add about 3 to 7% to our GDP. So from the standpoint of limited, you're absolutely right in the way you pose the question. It is limited. It doesn't mean it should not be done. It should definitely be done because, as we've sort of hinted at, throughout our conversation so far, it's not a matter of this instead of that. It is this in addition to that. So yes, there's some things that can be done there, and it's worthwhile, pursuing some of those things. So yes, intraprovincial trade, that kind of diversification, it can work, but it's certainly limited. And to go back to the previous question, we can't change our geography. I mean, we just have to keep that in mind. And Stephen has pointed out that there's some beneficial cost factors that are there for us. The shorter that distance is between farm or factory and point of consumption, the better it is for us. But yes, I would say limited, but definitely something that ought to be done.
Okay, anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, I'm going to go to another type of kind of a different question from an alumnus and investor who asked the question, what should be the strategy in terms of the chaotic stock markets? Right? So here's someone who's living this in real time. And I assume that the question is focused on government policy. So how does government policy respond? So I'm not sure if anybody wants to. Stephen, maybe you might want to take a try at that one.
I will try, but I'm more of an economist than a finance. I will just say, rather than giving general portfolio advice, just reiterate the fact that this disruptions create opportunities. And looking for where those opportunities are and putting money in them, especially in Canada right now, it's going to be a win-win, right? There's going to be lots of opportunities and get a nice return and create some jobs and invest in Canada in the meanwhile. I'll leave it as that because I'm not qualified to give financial advice.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a stab at that? No problem. Okay. So then I've got, I think, what is a really important question that's on the mind, I'm sure, of lots of our listeners here today. Canada seems to, as Patty noted, has not completely avoided, but we didn't seem to get hammered yesterday in the way that many people feared in terms of the announcements on reciprocal tariffs. But will our luck hold, right? So are tariffs now the new normal? Will a new deal eventually roll them back as we go into negotiations on a renewed USMCA or CUSMA? If talks resume, how can Canada boost its bargaining power? So I think the question really is about, how do we think strategically as we move forward in a context where we don't know what is coming, right? We don't know if things are going to go back to the way they were before, whether this is going to become our new normal, right? Or whether we need to be, thinking about a completely different normal for ourselves. So I know that's a really big question, but I think we're kind of thinking, what do we do now? And Patty, is it okay if I ask?
Sure.
You start on
Sure,
that?
sure. I mean, I two questions there. I mean, I do think this is the new normal. A few months ago, when we were working under the assumption that President Trump was using these tariffs as leverage, we could imagine them being put on, taken off. And maybe there's still a version of that. But I think as it becomes clearer that there is a strategy here about reinvigorating the US manufacturing sector, about potentially using tariffs for income to offset a tax cut, and so on. The signals coming from the US administration, and not just Donald Trump, but also many of the people around him, is that this is a tool that they intend to use in various ways and for different purposes for quite a while. Perhaps not in the way that they were used yesterday in the Rose Garden, but this is a tool that in their toolkit that they feel is very useful to them. So I think it's the new normal. To me, the only, well, not the only way, but the main way to increase our bargaining power is domestically, is to become the strongest and most resilient economy that we can become, so that these hits are not as significant when they come. That to me would be the figuring out how to get X or Y concession from the US. I'm not so sure that that's a game we can win, but I think strengthening our economy domestically is probably always the best solution in this moment.
Great, thank you. Stephen, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's a couple issues here. First of all, this is a new normal in the sense that as long as Trump is around and there's support for this North America reshoring, this is likely to continue, right? Whether this on net is going to hurt or harm Canada is the uncertainty, right?
Stephen, can I push you just a little bit on that? So you said
Sure.
North America reshoring. Is this not about US reshoring?
So yes, but this also comes in the context of like, this has happened before, right? We, aluminum and steel tariffs came into effect. They boosted profits for a couple of companies in the States temporarily. They didn't create very many jobs. It hurt manufacturing. And then Trump went away, renegotiated the trade agreement. The aluminum tariffs came down, and a lot of those companies have since, like, even more US companies failed since then in metals manufacturing and processing. So the problem is their manufacturing of steel and aluminum, for example, was tied to global fossil fuel prices, which were high and volatile. In Canada, we have abundant electricity from hydroelectric, right? So there's these fundamental differences that we can provide. And it's kind of an example of why tariffs aren't a solution to the production woes in the US. However, again, the bigger picture here is like, we had these trade disruptions from the last round of tariffs. Then we had all the supply disruptions after COVID, and then the geopolitical issues with trade with China. I said we, but I mean like the US here. And so the investment in the incentive to invest and do business in China has fundamentally changed over time. So a lot of US companies are hesitant to go to China. So instead they went to Taiwan and Vietnam and a bunch of other countries in Asia, right? They went to Mexico, right, where labor is cheap. I mean, labor's not cheap in Canada, right? But the whole point, I think, of these retaliatory tariffs is say, we want to keep this trend going, but we don't want those jobs going to other places in Asia. We don't want them to go to Mexico. We want them to come back to the States. And I think that's the idea of the Trump logic here.
Right.
The reality is, though, is that like Mexico's basically called the bluff. So this is the thing. Mexico didn't retaliate, right? They just got the tariffs. We've been living with them for a month, right? Because they didn't retaliate, because they realized that these linkages are going to take years and years to unwind. And if they do it too quick, and if they try to do it aggressively, like they could ruin US manufacturing industry, right? And this is sort of the reality, is that we do have a strong hand going into these negotiations, right? We have valuable resources that they need to support their manufacturing industry. We don't have low wages. We're not trying to steal their jobs. Like, we can work together on this. And there's things we can do to boost that. Like, forget Greenland for critical resources. We have infrastructure, we have knowledge, we know how to mine minerals in the cold. We are way more shovel ready in Canada. And unfortunately, we've sort of been running in the opposite direction, where we've been making it harder and harder to set up new production and manufacturing here. But we can improve that. We can improve the business environment, and that will boost our hand in negotiation, even if it's just a Canada-US trade agreement.
Great.
I don't think we can get away with this without making concessions, though. We have to make our markets more competitive by making these concessions. And I think the best example of this is just thinking about taxis, right?
So Stephen,
Okay.
we only have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can just, if you can just maybe complete that thought, and then we'll move to our final question.
Absolutely. So just think about it like taxis, right? Taxis are expensive. They're not really good service. And then Uber came along and disrupted it and made it more competitive. And
That's a
now
great example.
I have much better access to taxis when I need them on the moment. And it's the same thing. Like, we give up we improve our competitiveness of our dairy sector. I get cheaper dairy, I get better products and more diversity, right? And so there is this opportunity for win-win in the renegotiation.
Great, thank you. I want to pose a final question that, sort of sheds maybe a little bit more of an uplifting note, although Stephen was, your comments were very positive about looking forward as well. But given what each of you are seeing in your respective fields, are there really any innovative responses or emerging opportunities that you see as pointing a good, encouraging way forward? And Michael, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes. And I echo your comments about Stephen. One of the things I was making notes on when Stephen gave his opening remarks was the number of positive terms that he uses, and the will, the opportunities, we can do this. Apart from the response of ordinary Canadians to what has happened, a response which I think as it speaks to steel in the spine. It speaks to a belief, that we can fight, and we can win, as tough as the fight may be. In terms of specific to my field, I made a reference earlier to the supply chain strategy, the national supply chain strategy that Canada is still sort of working on. Having gone as far as setting up the office under Transport Canada, it is something that I think is positive because it recognizes the importance of the physical infrastructure for supply chains. Now, it's often very fashionable for people to talk about, well, we need smaller governments and so on. But the fact that this supply chain strategy, it recognizes the importance of diplomacy. So it's really looking at supply chain, not as an isolated field, but how it connects with national security and how it connects with diplomacy. And the third thing I want to point to in that strategy is that emphasis on small businesses. So there's an explicit line recognizing the value, the importance of.
Right.
So I think the fact that we are on the right direction when it comes to the way we think about supply chain, that certainly gives me hope.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Patty, a few thoughts there, maybe?
I'll try to end on an uplifting note. I do think that there is enormous opportunity in this moment. I think it's hard to do. I think there are a lot of things that we have known that we need to do for a long time, addressing the productivity problems in Canada, addressing competitiveness problems in Canada, as Michael said, infrastructure. There are all sorts of things that can be done and that need to be done to get us to be the strongest and most resilient economy that we can be. But that requires very serious minds coming together and figuring out how that's going to happen, who's going to take the lead on it, which specific steps need to be taken. So I'm very hopeful that we have the incentive to do that this time, and I hope I'm right.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add to that, and hopefully that we'll have some cooperation within the Federation to get some of that stuff done, right? Another challenge. Stephen. A final positive thought, although you've been the positive person for that.
Okay, well, maybe I'll spin it then. Look, no one wants a war, trade war or otherwise. We want to stand up for ourselves, but we know we're going to harm. There's mutual harm here if we go to war. Um, you know, this is a bit of a national security issue for the US, whether you believe that or not. But guess what? It is now for Canada. And we do need to stand up for ourselves. We will stand up for ourselves, whether this is spending our defense money here or making sure our nuclear power plants are Canadian made. We will improve Canada from this experience, and it can create a lot of opportunities in the meanwhile, and it'll make us more resilient going forward.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for this discussion. I know all of us could talk about this for the next 5 hours. Thanks so much to the audience for submitting questions. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to them all. I was kind of scrolling through looking at the questions saying, oh, what a great question. Oh, this is so great as well. Patty, Michael, Stephen, thank you so much for participating. It was a real pleasure to have this discussion with you today.